In the heart of New Orleans, a city known for its beauty, music, and mystery, there lies a tale that has endured for more than a century. It begins in 1888, when two sisters arrived quietly, their faces identical, yet their presence unsettling. No one knew where they came from, and no one could explain why they chose a shuttered townhouse on Dauphine Street as their home. From the moment they appeared, whispers followed them, stories of strange rituals, music drifting at odd hours, and shadows that did not move quite like they should. Neighbors swore they saw the sisters in two places at once, while others claimed they heard voices in an unknown tongue coming from a locked room. Over time, one sister vanished from sight, and when death was finally announced, no grave could be found. What remained was a legacy of unanswered questions, a mystery that blurred the line between truth and folklore. This is the story of the twin sisters of New Orleans. Sorry for the interruption. Where are you tuning in from? Drop it in the comments. New Orleans in 1888 was a city unlike any other in America. Gas lamps flickered along narrow cobblestone streets, casting long shadows against iron balconies and weathered shutters. The riverboats still carried travelers and traders into the heart of the city, and the air was heavy with the mingling scents of spices, tobacco, and the brackish water of the Mississippi. In the French Quarter, life spilled out into every corner. Street vendors called out to passers-by, fortune tellers whispered promises of hidden futures, and the sound of fiddles, banjos, and early brass drifted from dance halls. Jazz had not yet taken its full shape, but its heartbeat was already present, pulsing faintly in the music of Creole musicians and the rhythms of African drums. Yet beneath this lively scene, another city existed. One built on whispered rumors, half-remembered stories, and an uneasy balance between faith and superstition. Catholic churches stood beside shops selling charms and powders, and the line between prayer and spell was thinner here than anywhere else in the country. Voodoo queens had left their mark on the imagination of the city, and even those who dismissed such practices still avoided certain streets at night. Everyone carried a private story, something not spoken of in daylight but murmured in confidence over a drink or at a neighbor's door. The city itself seemed to encourage mystery. The thick air held sound differently, muffling footsteps and carrying voices through alleyways where no one stood. The fog that rolled off the river could hide entire carriages as they passed. The swamps beyond the city were said to hold secrets too old to name, and in the quarter, strangers appeared and disappeared with little explanation. In 1888, New Orleans was a place where the ordinary and the uncanny shared the same streets. Visitors often spoke of its contradictions. By day, the city bustled with commerce, with dockworkers unloading cargo and merchants shouting prices in English, French, and Spanish. By night, it transformed. Gaslight gave the architecture a ghostly quality, and music and laughter poured from saloons while elsewhere silence hung heavy. The quarter had a way of shifting moods, sometimes in the space of a single street. A person could feel perfectly safe on one corner, then uneasy the next, as though unseen eyes watched from darkened windows. It was in this atmosphere of beauty and unease that the story of the twin sisters first began to take shape. New Orleans in 1888 was not just a setting. It was a character in itself, alive with contradictions, a city of celebration and sorrow, of faith and fear, and above all, a city of secrets waiting to be revealed. They appeared in New Orleans quietly, without announcement, stepping down from a carriage as if they had always belonged to the city. The year was 1888, and arrivals were nothing unusual in a port town constantly receiving travelers from across the world. Yet these two sisters drew attention from the very first moment. They were identical in every feature, with the same pale skin, the same dark hair pinned beneath modest bonnets, and the same piercing gray eyes that seemed to linger a second too long when they met another's gaze. What unsettled people most was not their likeness, but the way their presence felt heavy, as though something unspoken followed them wherever they went. No one could say with certainty where they had come from. Some said they were from Europe, perhaps France, their speech carrying hints of an accent. Others insisted they were from the northern states, drifting south after some family tragedy. They did not explain themselves, and when asked, they smiled politely but gave little in return. In a city where strangers often arrived with tales of fortune, misfortune, or escape, these women offered nothing but silence. Their lack of story became a story in itself, whispered among neighbors and gossiped about in marketplaces. The sisters chose a house on Dauphine Street, a tall, narrow building with shuttered windows that remained closed even on warm evenings when most of the quarter threw open doors to catch the breeze. They kept to themselves, leaving rarely, walking always together, their steps perfectly in rhythm, as though practiced since childhood. Children watched them from behind fences, fascinated and uneasy, while grown men lowered their voices when the women passed. To the people of the quarter, the twins became a curiosity and a warning at once. Though identical in appearance, it soon became clear that their natures were not the same. One carried herself with ease, offering faint smiles to shopkeepers, her voice soft but not unfriendly. The other kept her eyes lowered, her hands clasped tightly as though guarding something within herself. It was said that while one greeted the world, the other seemed to retreat from it. This contrast only deepened the sense of mystery that surrounded them. In a city already brimming with tales of the strange and unexplained, the arrival of these sisters added a new layer of unease. They came without history, without family, without explanation, and the very absence of answers stirred the imagination of everyone who saw them. From their first days in New Orleans, the twin sisters belonged not to the everyday life of the quarter, but to the realm of whispered stories and uneasy fascination. The townhouse on Dauphine Street had stood for nearly half a century, weathered by storms that swept in from the Gulf and the slow decay of the damp New Orleans air. Its walls bore the faded charm of Creole architecture, tall and narrow, with wrought iron balconies curling like lace against the brick. But when the twin sisters took up residence, the house shifted in the eyes of the neighbors. What was once another old building became something different, something watched with suspicion. From the first day, the shutters were closed, even on the brightest afternoons when most families opened their windows to let the air pass through. Curtains remained drawn so tightly that no light could be seen from within, not even the faint glow of a candle. The front door was bolted from the inside, and visitors who dared to knock were met only with silence. Some said the house seemed to breathe differently, its silence heavier than the others on the street, as though it held something behind its walls that wished not to be disturbed. The neighbors could not help but notice the sisters' odd routines. They came and went together, always at dusk, their pale faces glimpsed for only moments before they slipped into the shadows of their home. No music or laughter ever rose from inside, no sound of dishes clattering, no footsteps on the balcony above. The townhouse gave the impression of emptiness, even though everyone knew it was not. Children, curious and daring, sometimes lingered near the gate, hoping to catch a glimpse of what lay within. They whispered about seeing shapes in the upstairs windows, faint and quick, like figures moving behind the curtains. Some swore they saw candlelight flicker just before midnight, only to vanish as soon as they pointed it out. Adults brushed off such talk, yet even they crossed the street at night rather than walk too close to the door. The house itself seemed to join the sisters in their secrecy. The wood creaked in unfamiliar rhythms, and vines grew quickly along the side wall, as if nature too wished to conceal it. A few said the air near its entrance felt colder than the rest of the street, though no one could explain why. In a neighborhood known for its vibrant color and sound, this home became a pocket of silence, a dark spot among brightness. The sisters never explained why they chose that particular house, but in time it became as much a part of their legend as they themselves. People did not simply speak of the twins. They spoke of the house on Dauphine Street, a place that had slipped quietly from ordinary life into the realm of mystery, a house that seemed to watch as much as it was watched. Whispers in the French Quarter traveled faster than the river current. In a city where news was carried not only by paper but by mouths eager for stories, the twin sisters became the subject of endless speculation. Market vendors spoke of them as they arranged their fruit and spices, voices lowered but words carrying clearly enough for others to hear. Streetcar riders glanced at one another when the sisters boarded, their silence filling the space as surely as any conversation. Parishioners leaving Mass exchanged quiet remarks in the churchyard, weaving tales from fragments of observation. What fascinated people most was not what the sisters did but what they did not do. No one had ever seen them sit at a cafe table, though the quarter thrived on long afternoons of coffee and chatter. They never lingered in public markets, never joined in community gatherings, never allowed themselves to be drawn into the rhythms of neighborhood life. Some insisted that they never ate at all, that their pale faces betrayed a hunger they tried to conceal. Others claimed that when they did buy food, it was always the same simple items, carried away quickly in a cloth bag, never enough to feed two people for long. Their appearances on the street seemed carefully timed. To some, this was nothing unusual. Many people in New Orleans preferred the cooler air of evening. But to others, it was evidence of something unnatural. Why, they wondered, would the sisters avoid the light if they had nothing to hide? The gossip grew wilder with each telling. One version of the story claimed the sisters were descendants of an old Creole family, disgraced long ago, returning in secret to reclaim their inheritance. Another said they were fugitives from Europe, hiding from some scandal too terrible to name. A few even whispered that they were not women at all, but spirits bound to the house on Dauphine Street, wearing human forms to walk among the living. Children dared each other to run past the house at night, laughing nervously as they claimed to hear faint whispers from behind the shutters. Grown men, after a drink too many, spoke of uneasy feelings that came over them if they crossed paths with the women in the twilight. And yet, for all the talk, no one had proof of anything. The sisters gave no answers, no explanations, no sign of concern about the rumors that surrounded them. In truth, the gossip revealed more about the city than about the women themselves. New Orleans in 1888 was a place where superstition lived side by side with faith, where mystery was often more powerful than fact. And so the whispers in the quarter continued, each tale building upon the last, until the line between truth and invention disappeared entirely. To see the sisters together was like watching one reflection step out of a mirror and stand beside the other. Their resemblance was so exact that even those who lived closest to them admitted they sometimes struggled to tell one apart from the other. The same dark hair, the same delicate features, the same pale skin that seemed untouched by the southern Sunday. Yet what unsettled people most was not the likeness of their faces, but the stark differences in the way they carried themselves. One of the sisters had a presence that, while quiet, was approachable. She lifted her chin when she walked, offered faint smiles to neighbors, and sometimes allowed her voice to drift gently into conversation when politeness demanded it. To the shopkeepers who saw her most often, she was the sister who could be spoken to, the one who left the impression of someone trying, at least in part, to belong to the world around her. She would nod when greeted, and though her words were few, her expression suggested she had more kindness than she wished to show. The other was entirely different. Her gaze rarely left the ground, her lips pressed together tightly as if sealing some secret within her. She walked with her hands clasped, shoulders slightly bent, avoiding the eyes of everyone who passed. Even when standing still, she gave the impression of someone who wished to be elsewhere, hidden away from any attention. Children called her the shadow of her sister, and even adults admitted that her silence left them uneasy. If one sister gave the faintest spark of warmth, the other seemed to draw the air around her into chill. This contrast only deepened the curiosity that surrounded them. How could two people so alike be so divided in spirit? The quarter, already a place where stories thrived, filled in the blanks with its own inventions. Some believed one sister had suffered an unspoken tragedy, leaving her locked away inside herself while her twin carried the burden of speaking for them both. Others suggested the difference revealed something darker, that perhaps the two halves of their nature were not natural at all, but evidence of something hidden beneath their outward sameness. To see them apart was rare, for they clung to one another as if bound by more than blood. And yet, even when side by side, it was impossible not to notice the distance between them, a silent rift that made their likeness all the more disturbing. In their mirrored faces, the community saw not harmony, but duality, two identical shells, carrying within them two utterly different souls. This uneasy balance became yet another reason why the sisters remained a source of fascination, a mystery the quarter could not ignore. It was not long before the quiet of Dauphine Street was disturbed by curious happenings that no one could easily explain. Neighbors who lay awake at night began to speak of faint sounds that drifted from the townhouse, strange voices rising and falling in a rhythm that resembled chanting. At first it was dismissed as imagination, the kind of thing a restless mind might create in the silence of midnight. But as the weeks passed, more than one family swore they had heard the same low tones, a murmuring that seemed to follow some hidden pattern. Those who lived across the street told of a different sight. They claimed that behind the tightly drawn curtains of the upper floor, they had seen the flicker of candle flames moving in deliberate patterns. The light would dance for long stretches of time, dimming and then returning, as though someone inside carried candles back and forth across the room. On some nights, the glow was steady, almost like an altar, its faint shimmer reaching out into the darkened street. It gave the unsettling impression that something was being performed, something secret and carefully hidden from the outside world. The most unnerving detail, however, was the smell. A bitter, pungent scent of burning herbs would sometimes drift down into the street, carried on the humid air. It was unlike the familiar fragrance of incense from the churches, or the spices that filled the markets. This smell was harsher, stranger, as though roots and leaves not meant for cooking had been set aflame. Neighbors muttered that it clung to the air longer than it should, leaving behind an aftertaste of smoke that seemed to settle in the chest. In New Orleans, where belief in the unseen ran as deep as the river, people quickly offered explanations. Some whispered of voodoo, convinced the sisters had brought secret knowledge with them, practicing old rites under the cover of night. Others spoke of seances, insisting they must be communing with spirits, seeking guidance or perhaps something darker. The stories multiplied, each one more elaborate than the last, until even those who had heard nothing began to feel uneasy when passing the house. No one dared confront the sisters directly. Instead, the rumors spread through markets, carriages, and church steps, feeding the growing sense that the house on Dauphine Street was more than a home. It had become a stage for unseen rituals, a place where the ordinary rules of night and day no longer applied. And though no proof was ever shown, the image of the sisters in candlelight, their voices rising in unearthly chant, became fixed in the minds of all who lived nearby. The mystery of the twin sisters deepened one warm evening when a carriage arrived at the house on Dauphine Street carrying a local physician. His presence did not go unnoticed, for in a neighborhood where every movement was observed and remembered, the sudden appearance of a doctor at their door stirred immediate curiosity. Until then, no one had ever seen the sisters welcome a visitor, much less summon one. Neighbors watched from behind shutters and across balconies as the doctor stepped inside, the heavy door closing firmly behind him. What transpired within the townhouse was never spoken of openly. The physician, a man known for his careful manner and long years of practice, later described the encounter only in fragments, and always with visible unease. When pressed by colleagues, he admitted that he had been called to examine one of the sisters, though which one he would not say. She was said to be pale to the point of translucence, her body trembling with a weakness that no medicine seemed to explain. Her pulse was faint, her skin cool, yet her eyes carried a strange intensity, as though something unseen kept her alive against the will of her body. In his private notes, which surfaced years later, he wrote of an ailment unlike any other, one not bound by the natural order of illness. He described symptoms that shifted from moment to moment, strength that returned suddenly and vanished again, a voice that at times spoke clearly and then fell into whispers too low to hear, and a fever that seemed to burn without heat. The physician confessed he could find no cause, no rational explanation that would satisfy the science of his time. When he left the house that night, his face was ashen, and he spoke little to those who inquired. What he did say was enough to unsettle the quarter. He told them he would not return, not for any fee, not for any reason. His words carried weight, for this was a man who had treated fevers, injuries, and even the hidden illnesses most families kept behind closed doors. Yet whatever he had witnessed on Dauphine Street had shaken him in a way nothing else had. The sisters did not summon another physician, nor did they ever speak of the visit. But from that night on, the air around their home seemed heavier, the sense of unease deeper. If before they were a mystery, now they were something more troubling, for the one man trained to bring clarity had left with only silence. And in a city already rich with rumor, silence could be more terrifying than any answer. Not long after the doctor's visit, a new mystery began to stir the quarter. Late at night, when the gas lamps burned low and the streets fell quiet, faint strains of music could be heard drifting from the house on Dauphine Street. At first, only a few passers-by claimed to hear it, but soon the stories spread, and more than one neighbor swore that piano notes echoed softly through the walls. The melodies were unlike anything most had heard before. They were beautiful in moments, delicate and graceful, like the music of a parlor performance. Yet they would twist suddenly into strange dissonance. A pleasant harmony could collapse into jarring chords, the kind that unsettled the ear and stirred an unease that lingered long after the sound faded. Some swore the music shifted so suddenly it felt as if two players were battling at the keys, one weaving light and charm, the other forcing darkness and chaos into the tune. Curiously, no one could ever say for certain who played. The sisters were rarely seen in daylight, and when glimpsed, neither carried the look of a trained musician. No piano was ever delivered to their home, no movers struggling with heavy instruments through the narrow doorway. Yet night after night, the music returned, always beginning without warning and ending abruptly, as though cut short by an unseen hand. Children whispered that the house itself was playing, that the walls remembered old songs and brought them to life when the city slept. Older residents were less fanciful, but no less troubled. They wondered whether the music was part of the same strange rituals already rumored within. Some suggested seances conducted with sound instead of words, melodies meant to summon spirits. Others whispered of voodoo chants woven into the music, the keys of the piano used like incantations to open doors best left closed. Those who lingered too long near the house claimed the music had an effect on them. A gentle tune could lull the heart into calm, only for the sharpness of the next chord to rattle the nerves. Some described feeling as though the sound reached into them, tugging at hidden emotions, stirring sorrow or fear they could not explain. A few admitted to dreaming of the music even after they returned to their beds, waking with its echo still in their minds. Whether one sister or both played remained uncertain, and perhaps it was this very uncertainty that unsettled the community most. The house on Dauphine Street had already become a place of silence, of shadows and secrets. Now, with the arrival of music in the walls, it seemed to have found its own haunting voice, one that both invited and repelled, beautiful and yet deeply wrong. It was in the spring of 1888 when the rhythm of the sisters' appearances shifted. For months, they had always been seen together, moving as though bound by an invisible thread, two reflections walking in step. But then, without warning, only one of them appeared in public. She was seen at dusk, just as before, her pale figure slipping through the quarter, her bonnet lowered, her steps measured and deliberate. Yet beside her there was no mirror image, no silent twin to match her stride. At first, neighbors thought little of it. Perhaps the other was unwell, confined to the shuttered townhouse until her strength returned. The story of the physician's visit not long before was still fresh in people's minds, and illness seemed a natural explanation. But as the days passed, and only one sister was ever glimpsed, whispers began to grow. No one could remember a single time when the sisters had been apart for so long. Their absence from one another seemed unnatural, as though something had been broken that was not meant to be. Some said the missing sister had died, her body hidden within the house while the surviving twin carried on the routine they had once shared. Others dismissed this but offered stranger ideas. They spoke of one sister retreating into shadows so deeply she no longer walked among the living, of some transformation that left her no longer human enough to be seen. A few insisted that they had caught sight of movement in the upper windows at night, a fleeting figure passing by, pale and thin, as though trapped behind the curtains. The sister who remained in public gave no explanation. She walked the same streets at the same hours, her face calm, her expression unreadable. If asked about her twin, she offered nothing, no words, not even the briefest glance to suggest acknowledgement of the question. Her silence only fed the unease, for in a city where gossip thrived, silence was more dangerous than any admission. By the end of the week, The absence of the other sister was no longer just a curiosity. It became a source of dread, a question that gnawed at the minds of everyone who passed the shuttered house. Where was she? What had happened behind those closed doors on Dauphine Street? Illness was an easy answer, but few truly believed it. In a city already steeped in mystery, the disappearance of one half of a pair that had seemed inseparable carried with it the weight of something far stranger. And though no proof was ever offered, the unease lingered like a shadow across the quarter. The whispers that surrounded the house on Dauphine Street eventually reached the ears of the parish priest. In a city where faith and superstition often lived side by side, it was not unusual for clergy to be drawn into matters that stretched beyond the walls of the church. Parishioners had begun to murmur to him about the sisters, about their strange habits, their absence from Mass, and the unsettling stories of music, chanting, and shadows in their home. At first he dismissed much of it as gossip, the kind of talk that thrived in the quarter. But when the rumors of a disappearance reached his confessional, he felt compelled to act. One afternoon he walked to Dauphine Street, his cassock trailing behind him, and knocked firmly at the heavy wooden door. For several minutes there was no answer. He was about to leave when the door opened just slightly, and one of the sisters stood in the shadows of the entry. Neighbors who saw the visit said she let him in without a word, and the door closed behind him as though swallowed by the silence of the house. What he found inside was never shared openly. The priest was a man known for his steadiness, not prone to exaggeration or fear. Yet when he emerged an hour later, his face was pale and his steps hurried. He did not stop to speak to anyone on the street, nor did he return a second time. Those who saw him pass through the quarter that evening whispered that he looked shaken, as though the very air of the house had left its mark upon him. Years later, fragments of his private diary came to light, offering the only record of what he experienced. He wrote of an atmosphere within the house that pressed upon the soul, a heaviness that could not be explained by illness or grief. He mentioned seeing things that did not align with the order of God's creation, though he did not describe them in detail. In one passage he wrote simply, "There is something unnatural within those walls, something I cannot bless nor drive away." The priest never spoke of the sisters again from the pulpit, nor did he include them in public prayers. His silence only deepened the sense of dread surrounding the townhouse. For the faithful of the parish, his reluctance to speak was more telling than any sermon. If a man of God could not put words to what he encountered, then perhaps it was better left unspoken. Yet his brief, unsettling visit confirmed what many already feared, that the house on Dauphine Street was no longer merely a place of secrecy, but a place touched by something that could not be named. The streets of the French Quarter were always alive with stories. Tales passed from one mouth to another, reshaped with every telling, until truth and imagination blurred together like smoke in the humid air. By the late summer of 1888, the sisters on Dauphine Street had become the center of those stories. Neighbors, shopkeepers, and carriage drivers all swore they had seen things that could not be explained, and each story fed the next. One woman who sold pralines near Jackson Square insisted she had seen both sisters walking past her stall at the same time. One wore a dark shawl, the other a pale bonnet, and yet they moved in perfect step, their faces so alike that the sight chilled her to the bone. A cabman claimed he picked up one sister on Royal Street and dropped her off near the river, only to spot her again moments later crossing Bourbon Street in the opposite direction. Others whispered of shadowy figures that lingered in the doorways of their townhouse long after the lamps had been snuffed out for the night. The most unsettling stories came from those who dared to look too closely. A seamstress who once fitted them for dresses said she could never quite tell which was which, even when they stood still before her. At times, she believed she was speaking to one, only to find the other answering in the same voice, without the slightest break in manner. Their resemblance was not merely physical, it was as if they moved with a single mind, though their temperaments could not have been more different. As the gossip spread, the sisters became less like people and more like phantoms in the city's imagination. Children on street corners whispered dares to approach the townhouse at dusk. Old men at the tavern spoke of doubles, of omens, of spirits that wore the shape of the living. Some recalled older tales from the city's past stories of mirror images, of doppelgangers said to herald misfortune. In New Orleans, where superstition lay just beneath the surface of daily life. Such stories were not easily dismissed. Yet for every rumor there were those who defended the sisters, saying they were only victims of the quarter's restless tongue. Perhaps people saw shadows where none existed. Perhaps chance encounters created illusions of being in two places at once. But doubt lingered. And the more the sisters withdrew into their shuttered house, the more the city's curiosity grew. By then, the mystery was no longer confined to Dauphine Street. It had spilled into the very fabric of the French Quarter, leaving even the most skeptical to wonder if the twins were flesh and blood at all, or something far stranger. Mardi Gras in New Orleans was a spectacle of color, sound, and abandon. By the winter of 1888, the celebration was already well established, with parades spilling through the narrow streets, music rising above the clatter of carriages, and revelers dressed in every manner of costume. That year, the city seemed determined to forget its troubles in a whirlwind of masks and laughter. Yet amid the music and merriment, a new story was born, one that turned eyes once again toward the sisters of Dauphine Street. On the evening of the celebration, the twins were seen stepping into the crowd, dressed in elaborate gowns. One wore deep crimson with a feathered mask that shimmered under the lamplight, while the other chose ivory trimmed with gold, her face hidden behind a porcelain mask that gave her an almost ghostly appearance. Their presence caused an immediate stir. Some marveled at their beauty. Others whispered about their mystery. But no one could deny the strange aura that seemed to follow them wherever they went. As they moved through the festivities, witnesses claimed their movements were too synchronized, too precise, as if they were not two individuals, but mirrored reflections gliding through the crowd. They paused at stalls, exchanged words with strangers, and even joined in the dances. Yet the sense of unease never lifted, and before the night was over, it deepened into something far more chilling. Several people, unrelated and scattered across different parts of the quarter, swore they had seen not two sisters, but three. Two were together, seen hand in hand weaving through the masked dancers. The third, however, was spotted standing apart, high on a balcony overlooking the street. This third figure wore no mask, her face pale and bare, watching the revelry below with an expression that unsettled all who looked up. Some claimed she smiled faintly, though her eyes held no joy. Others said she raised her hand in a silent gesture, acknowledging the crowd before vanishing into the darkness of the house behind her. The accounts circulated quickly in the days that followed. Some insisted the third figure was an illusion, perhaps another reveler dressed in similar costume. Others whispered of doubles, of spirits, of an unnatural presence walking among the living. For a city steeped in folklore and mystery, the idea that the twins were not merely two, but perhaps something more, spread like fire. By the time Mardi Gras had ended, the streets returned to their quiet routines, but the story lingered. No one could agree on what they had truly seen, yet no one forgot it either. The image of three sisters, two among the living, one watching from above, settled into the fabric of the legend, leaving the quarter to wonder whether that night had revealed a truth better left hidden. The townhouse on Dauphine Street had long been a place of mystery, but it was the back room, always locked, always shuttered, that drew the most fearful whispers. From the outside, its windows were sealed tight curtains drawn so thick no light escaped. No one had ever seen that door open, not even the servants who occasionally came and went. Yet, late at night, neighbors swore they heard sounds coming from within. Those who lived closest to the sisters claimed they had pressed their ears to the plaster walls, straining to catch what unfolded beyond that hidden space. What they described was unsettling. At times it was the sharp scrape of something against the floor, like furniture being dragged from one corner to another. At other moments, it was the rhythmic pacing of feet, back and forth, steady and unrelenting, but most unnerving of all were the voices. Not one, but two, sometimes rising in heated argument, other times murmuring in tones so low they were nearly impossible to make out. The voices did not sound like ordinary conversation. Several neighbors insisted they were speaking in a language unknown to them, words that rolled together in harsh, unfamiliar syllables. Some swore it sounded like German. Others whispered of an older tongue, one not meant for common ears. What no one could deny was the intensity. At times, The voices rose in such fury that the walls themselves seemed to tremble, only to fall suddenly silent, leaving the listeners with the uneasy sense that they had been heard in return. Children were warned not to play near that end of the house, for they would often return home pale-faced, saying they had heard scratching, as though nails raked across wood from the inside. One boy told his mother he saw the doorknob rattle as though someone or something was struggling to get out. Adults dismissed him, but not without unease, for too many others had confessed to seeing the same. The mystery of the locked room became a subject of hushed speculation throughout the quarter. Was one sister hiding the other? Was there a third presence, unseen but always near? Some suggested it was nothing more than illness confined behind closed doors. Others whispered darker possibilities that the sisters were keeping something there, something they dared not let into the light. Whatever truth lay behind that door, the sounds persisted, scratching, pacing, the rise and fall of strange words. And each night, as the city settled into uneasy sleep, the townhouse seemed to breathe with a life of its own, its secrets sealed behind the locked room that no one dared open. It was late in the afternoon when the incident occurred, a time when the French Quarter was alive with vendors calling out their wares and carriages rattling over the stones. Without warning, one of the sisters collapsed in the middle of the street. Those who saw it described her fall as sudden and violent, as if her body had been struck by an invisible force. Within moments, a small crowd gathered around her. Some offered water, others fanned her in a panic, but her eyes were closed and her skin had gone pale as wax. Before long, a carriage was summoned, and she was carried back to the townhouse on Dauphine Street. Her twin walked beside her, face hidden beneath a veil, expression unreadable. Neighbors noted the way she moved, hurried, yet strangely composed, as though she knew the outcome before it had even begun. The doors to the house shut behind them, and from that day forward, the fallen sister was never again seen in public. The absence did not go unnoticed. At first it was explained away by illness. Some claimed they glimpsed a physician arriving late at night, slipping quickly inside and departing with a face heavy with worry. Others insisted no doctor ever came at all. Days turned into weeks, and still no one saw the missing twin. The shutters remained drawn, and the faint glow of lamplight burned well into the small hours of the morning. What troubled the neighbors even more was the change in the sister who remained visible. She walked alone now, moving through the quarter with a silence that unsettled those who watched her pass. She no longer smiled, no longer offered greetings, no longer seemed to acknowledge the world around her. Some whispered that grief had transformed her, while others suspected something far stranger. A woman who once appeared vibrant and alive now carried herself with a heaviness, as though she bore the weight of two souls instead of one. The rumors multiplied quickly. Some said the ill sister had died, her body hidden away inside the house. Others claimed she was still alive but confined to the locked back room, her cries smothered by the heavy walls. A few even dared to suggest that the surviving twin was not the same woman at all, that something had shifted, and no one could be certain which sister now walked among them. Whatever the truth, the household grew quieter, the mystery deeper. The fall in the street had been sudden, but its echoes lingered long after. The people of New Orleans began to look upon the surviving twin not with sympathy, but with a wary distance, as though she carried with her a secret illness that had nothing to do with the body and everything to do with the soul. The news came quietly, as if carried on a whisper rather than proclaimed aloud. One of the sisters, it was said, had died. There was no mourning procession through the streets, no carriages draped in black, no gathering of neighbors paying their respects. Instead, the announcement slipped through the quarter in fragments, spoken from lips that could not say how they had heard it, only that it was true. The house on Dauphine Street had grown still, its shutters closed tighter than ever, and for many that silence was proof enough. When the official records were checked, the name was there. A single line written in the careful hand of a clerk confirmed her death, the cause described only as illness. There was nothing unusual in the entry at first glance, no hint of anything beyond a passing from this world to the next. But when curious eyes turned to the cemeteries of New Orleans, a different story began to take shape. The city of the dead, with its rows of above-ground tombs and crumbling vaults, was always open to those who wished to wander. People searched for her grave, expecting to find some marker, however small. But none could be located. Families who had long tended their tombs said they saw no new inscription, no fresh plaster, no sign of burial at all. Her name might have been written in the books, but in the cemeteries themselves, she had vanished. The absence unsettled the community. In New Orleans, burials were as public as births, with neighbors gathering to walk the narrow paths between tombs, to light candles, to pray, to ensure the departed were not forgotten. To deny such a ritual was rare, and when it happened, it almost always hinted at scandal or secrecy. Whispers spread that the sisters had buried her in the dead of night, slipping into the cemetery under cover of darkness to seal her away where no one could see. Others doubted even that much. What if no body had been buried at all? The surviving twin did nothing to ease suspicions. She was seen less and less, and when she did emerge, her movements were strange. Some claimed she walked the streets as though dazed, her eyes fixed on nothing. Others said she seemed sharper than ever, her gaze cutting and unblinking, as if she dared anyone to question her. Those who had once thought they could tell the sisters apart now admitted doubt. Was it truly the living twin who remained? Or had something been switched in the silence of that locked house? There were those who believed the missing grave was proof that the dead sister was not truly gone. Perhaps she lingered in the locked back room, neither alive nor dead, her existence erased from record but not from the world itself. A priest quietly suggested that the burial records might have been forged a way of closing a chapter that was never meant to end. And in taverns, men spoke in low voices of darker things, that the sisters had found a way to cheat death, that one had been consumed by the other, body and soul. Whatever truth lay hidden, the fact remained. A death had been recorded, a name had been written, and yet the grave could not be found. In a city that lived as closely with its dead as with its living, that absence became its own kind of presence. The French Quarter carried it like a weight, a silent question that hung over every street. The sister was gone, and yet she was not. And those who passed by the townhouse on Dauphine Street could not help but glance upward, wondering if the missing grave was watching them from behind shuttered windows. In the months that followed the quiet announcement of death, the city adjusted uneasily to the presence of only one sister. The lone twin was now a familiar figure on the streets of the French Quarter, her dark dress blending with the shadows, her face hidden beneath a veil that never seemed to lift. She walked with purpose but without haste, as though every step was measured, as though she were counting her own footsteps against something unseen. People noted the change in her demeanor. Where once she had occasionally smiled or exchanged brief words, now she was silent. Her movements were deliberate, almost ritualistic, and her eyes, when glimpsed, appeared haunted. Yet despite her solitary figure, stories began to spread that she was not as alone as she appeared. Neighbors swore they saw another shape in the windows of the Dauphine Street townhouse. Some described it as a pale face lingering behind lace curtains, vanishing when met with a second glance. Others claimed to see a shadow pacing the length of the shuttered room, keeping time with the footsteps of the living sister below. A washerwoman passing late one evening insisted she saw both sisters together, one standing in the doorway, the other just behind, her hand resting lightly on the first's shoulder. Yet when she blinked, there was only one. The most unsettling accounts came from those who encountered the lone twin after nightfall. On more than one occasion, passers-by told of following her as she walked home from the market or church. At first she seemed alone, but then at the edge of lamplight, a second figure appeared a step behind her, moving in silence, always in rhythm with her stride. Witnesses could never describe the figure clearly, only that it seemed familiar, too familiar, as though it shared the same face. Some were so disturbed they refused to walk that route again. The effect on the quarter was profound. Conversations at taverns and markets grew hushed whenever her name arose. Children dared each other to run past the townhouse, yet even they did not linger near its gates. Adults avoided her entirely, crossing streets to keep distance, not out of cruelty but out of something deeper, an instinctive fear of what could not be explained. The twin herself seemed unaffected by the rumors, though she must have been aware of the stares. She carried herself with an air that was neither defensive nor inviting, as if the world around her no longer mattered. Some suggested she was weighed down by grief, but others believed she was guarding a secret. Perhaps, they whispered, she was never truly alone at all. Perhaps the other sister still walked with her, unseen to most but present all the same. And so the legend grew. A single twin walked the streets of New Orleans, and yet she was not solitary. Behind the shutters of Dauphine Street, at the corners of lamplit alleys, and in the unsettled imaginations of all who lived nearby, there were always two, one living, one dead, or perhaps neither belonged fully to either world. It was not long after whispers of the lone twin filled the French Quarter that a curious discovery came to light. A bundle of writings, old and worn, was said to have surfaced. No one could say with certainty how they had been found. Some claimed a servant who once worked in the Dauphine Street townhouse had kept them hidden, fearful of what they contained. Others believed they had been left intentionally, slipped into the world like a message meant to outlive its author. Regardless of their origin, the writings were quickly believed to belong to one of the sisters. The journal, if it could be called that, was fragmented. Loose sheets bound together with string, some stained with water, others smudged with ink that had run as though written in haste. Yet even in its broken state, the words were troubling. They spoke of visions, fleeting images that came unbidden, sometimes in dreams, sometimes while awake. Faces in mirrors that shifted before the eyes. Reflections that did not match the movements of the one standing before them. Descriptions of seeing herself outside her own body, as though she were both the observer and the observed. As the entries continued, the tone grew darker. The writer confessed to confusion that deepened by the day, unable to fully grasp who she was or where her boundaries lay. At times she claimed to know she was one of two, and yet there were moments when she felt as though she was not separate at all, as though her identity blurred into her sister's until she could no longer distinguish where one ended and the other began. She wrote of waking in the night convinced she had spoken words only to find her sister's lips moving with the same voice. She described laughter that echoed twice when only one had laughed. Perhaps most unsettling were the passages where she admitted a gnawing fear. We are not truly two one-line read, but neither are we one. Something binds us, something unseen. Another entry whispered of a shadow between them, a third presence that lingered close, silent, and watchful. It knows us better than we know ourselves, she wrote, and it waits. Some who read the journal dismissed it as the product of fragile nerves, the ramblings of a woman overcome by illness or grief, but others saw in it confirmation of what the city already suspected. The sisters were not ordinary, and whatever afflicted them was beyond the reach of physicians or priests. The confusion of identity, the fear of not being truly separate, aligned too closely with the sightings, the stories of doubles, the glimpses of more than two. The journal ended abruptly, without conclusion. The final page bore only a single line, scrawled hastily, the ink dark and uneven. If one of us falls, does the other remain, or do we both? That question lingered like smoke over the French Quarter. It was not merely the tragedy of one sister lost and the other left behind, but the haunting possibility that their lives had never been separate to begin with. And as the pages passed from hand to hand, more than one reader wondered if the journal had been written by the living twin, the dead one, or perhaps by both together, voices entwined on the same page. Years passed before the house on Dauphine Street finally stood empty. The shutters that had long been drawn remained closed, the front steps gathering dust, the iron gate rusting quietly under the damp air of the quarter. Tenants had not come and gone as with other homes. It seemed the place itself resisted new life, clinging instead to silence. When the last of the bills went unpaid and the house was legally returned to its owner, the landlord came to inspect the property. It was then that curiosity and obligation drew him to the one place no one had dared to enter for decades. The locked back room. The landlord was not a man of superstition. He had heard the rumors, yes, but he dismissed them as the talk of idle neighbors. Still, as he pressed the key into the lock, he admitted later that his hand trembled. The door creaked open with a groan, the stale air rushing out as though it had been trapped inside for years. What he saw in that room would never leave him. The space was bare of ordinary furnishings. No bed, no chairs, no signs of comfort. Instead, The walls were marked with strange symbols drawn in soot and candle wax, circles layered over circles, lines intersecting in patterns that seemed to mean something to whoever made them. The landlord described them as both meticulous and frantic, as if they had been drawn and redrawn countless times. At the center of the room stood a table, heavy and old, its surface scarred with scratches as though someone had clawed at it in desperation. Upon the table were remnants of melted candles, their wax pooled thick like frozen rivers. But it was the smell that struck him most. A mixture of herbs, something burned, and something else he could not name. It was sharp, metallic, and clung to his clothes long after he left. On the floor lay scraps of parchment, covered in writing similar to the journal once whispered about. The words were scattered, half-finished, some crossed out violently. Phrases such as "the shadow between us," and "not two, not one," appeared again and again. And then there was the final discovery. In the corner of the room, partially concealed beneath a rotting cloth, was a small trunk. Inside were bones, fragile and discolored with age. Human bones, though too few to form a complete body. A skull was absent, yet the shape of a ribcage, a handful of long bones, and fragments of smaller ones were unmistakable. The landlord recoiled in horror, slamming the trunk shut. He later told confidants he wished he had never opened it at all. Word of his discovery spread quickly through the quarter, fueling the darkest legends of the sisters. Some said the bones belonged to the twin who had supposedly died, her body never buried in consecrated ground. Others believed they were older, relics of someone else entirely, perhaps tied to the rituals whispered about for so long. And still others dared to suggest the bones were not of one person, but fragments of more than one, collected and kept for purposes no one could name. The locked back room became the heart of the legend, the place where superstition and fear found their strongest anchor. Whatever truth the landlord uncovered that day, he refused to speak of it in detail again. He sealed the door, left the house to decay, and carried the weight of what he had seen in silence. But the city remembered. From then on, the name of the twins was never spoken without mention of the room, the symbols, and the bones. And in the lore of New Orleans, their story passed fully into darkness. In the decades that followed the sisters' story, New Orleans found itself torn between memory and myth. Historians combed through parish records, city registries, and faded newspaper clippings, searching for clarity. They found fragments, hints of two women who once lived on Dauphine Street, but never the certainty they sought. Birth certificates listed their names, but inconsistencies appeared in the handwriting, and in some records only one name was present. Marriage ledgers contained no mention of them, nor did baptismal rolls. It was as if the sisters lived on the edge of official recognition, part of the city but never fully within it. Folklorists, meanwhile, embraced the strangeness. They argued that the absence of solid evidence was not a void, but a foundation for legend. To them, the sisters represented more than two women. They embodied the tension between Catholic ritual and Creole mysticism, between the old world's rigid order and the new world's restless hunger for mystery. Oral traditions told of twin spirits who could not be bound by ordinary life or ordinary death. Some said they were cursed, others claimed they were gifted, but all agreed their presence lingered long after their doors were shuttered. Descendants, too, have weighed in over the years. Families who traced their roots back to the quarter whispered of a distant tie, an aunt or cousin who had once spoken of the twins in hushed tones. Letters passed down through generations hinted at visits to the strange house, where the women seemed both gracious and unsettling, always finishing one another's sentences, always speaking as if the world beyond their parlor was somehow less real than the one they inhabited. Yet even among descendants, the line between memory and invention blurred. What was preserved as truth in one household was dismissed as superstition in another. Some historians suggested the sisters suffered from an affliction now known but poorly understood in their time. Perhaps a shared illness of the mind, an echo of madness passed between them in their isolation. They pointed to the diary entries, the strange drawings, and the confusion of identity as evidence of delusion. Others countered that such explanations stripped the story of its cultural depth. To them, The sisters were not merely unwell, but participants in practices older than the city itself, rites that mingled African, French, and Caribbean traditions into something uniquely their own. And then there are those who claim the simplest answer is also the most disturbing, that the sisters were neither wholly mad nor wholly mystic, but something in between. Women whose lives straddled fact and folklore until the boundary between the two no longer mattered. To the neighbors who swore they saw both sisters after one had died, to the landlord who uncovered bones in the locked room, to the priest who wrote of unnatural things without explanation, the story was real enough, no matter what historians might conclude. In the end, the tale of the twins persists not because of what can be proven, but because of what cannot. Madness, spiritual practice, or something stranger still, the truth of their lives remains suspended between history and legend. And in a city that thrives on stories, where every alleyway holds a ghost and every courtyard whispers a secret, perhaps that is why their mystery endures. Not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a reminder that some lives resist explanation and some shadows never fade. To this day, the story of the twin sisters lingers in the air of New Orleans, like the faint scent of magnolia blossoms carried on the breeze, beautiful yet unsettling. Walk the narrow streets of the French Quarter at night, and you may hear a guide pause before an old townhouse, lowering their voice as they begin to tell the story. The group gathers close, candles flicker from doorways, and the shadows seem to lean in as the tale unfolds. It is said the house where the sisters once lived still carries a chill that no summer heat can dispel. Some claim to have heard the faint echo of a piano drifting through its shuttered windows long after the instrument itself was removed. Others swear they have seen the reflection of two women staring down from a balcony that has stood empty for over a century. In the bars of Bourbon Street, the legend has taken on a life of its own. Patrons raise their glasses to the sisters as if they were ghostly companions, toasting their memory with a mix of reverence and unease. Musicians sing of them in ballads that blur history with imagination, weaving verses of love, madness, and secrets locked away. The line between fact and fiction, always thin in New Orleans, disappears entirely when their names are spoken after midnight. They are no longer just two women who lived in 1888, but symbols of the city's darker poetry, enigmas that refuse to fade. For the guides, the bartenders, and the locals who keep the story alive, the truth of what happened inside that townhouse matters less than the persistence of the mystery itself. Were they victims of misfortune bound by illness and superstition? Were they participants in rituals too strange for their neighbors to comprehend? Or were they something more, beings caught between worlds, unable to rest in life or in death? Each retelling offers a different answer, yet none erase the questions. And so, the twins remain. In whispered rumors that drift through the quarter. In the curious glances of travelers who swear they felt a presence beside them. In the quiet awe of those who walk past their former home and sense they are being watched. They are part of the fabric of the city now, as enduring as the wrought iron balconies and the cobblestone streets. Perhaps that is the true power of their story. Not the certainty of facts, but the persistence of wonder. For in New Orleans, where ghosts walk openly and legends thrive as naturally as jazz, the twin sisters remind us that not every mystery is meant to be solved. Some are meant to endure, to be passed from one generation to the next, reshaped and retold until they become more than history. They become folklore. They become a part of us. And as long as the French Quarter endures, as long as the city celebrates its strange and haunted heart, the twin sisters will linger in its shadows. Their tale reminds us that some mysteries do not rest, and some stories are never finished.